Okay, I think we should get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Chet Kerr. I'm on the board of the Irvington Historical Society, and I welcome all of you to today's presentation entitled Towards a New Grammar of Justice, John Swanson Jacobs' Autobiography as a Spectacular Performance of Freedom. And so everybody knows, we're recording today's session, and we'll put it up on YouTube in a couple of days. So if you want to go back and review it again, please do. And we're going to have a time at the end of the presentation for questions and answers. If you have questions as we go along or at the end, please put them in the chat, and then we'll go through the questions, and hopefully Jonathan will be able to answer them for you. It's my real pleasure to welcome as our presenter today, Jonathan Schroeder, who's an historian, a literary critic, and a lecturer at the Rhode Island School of Design. In 2016, shortly after receiving his PhD at the University of Chicago, Jonathan had this remarkable discovery and rediscovered John Swanson Jacobs' long-lost autobiographical slave narrative. It was entitled "The United States Governed by 600,000 Despots, A True Story of Slavery," and it was found in an Australian archive. Republished by the University of Chicago in 2024, his edition returns this incredible narrative to America after 169 years and features the first full-length biography of Harriet Jacobs' globe-spanning brother, John Swanson Jacob, and that autobiography is entitled "No Longer Yours: The Lives of John Swanson Jacobs." Jonathan is also the co-editor of Ahab Unbound, Melville and the Material Turn, and the co-director of Congress of the Birds, a 501c3 organization that annually rescues, rehabilitates, and releases over 1,000 of Rhode Island's native and migratory birds. He is a recipient of long-term fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, John Carter Brown Library at Brown University, and the American Antiquarian Society. He is currently editing Lauren Berlant, a reader writing Prisoners of Loss, an Atlantic History of Nostalgia, and planning and building a 42-acre forest wildlife rehabilitation center in Rhode Island. So we're very, very lucky to have Jonathan join us today. So please join me in welcoming to our program. Jonathan, I'm going to turn my camera off and you're off to the races. Thank you.
Thank you, Chet, for that gracious introduction. And thank you, Veronica, also for the invitation to come speak this afternoon. And thanks to all of you for making time on what at least in Providence, is a really beautiful, unseasonably warm afternoon. So I'm delighted to have you here today.
Oops. Jonathan, I'm afraid oh, there you go.
No worries. Yeah, it's great to be here and to talk to you on this lovely afternoon about John Jacobs. I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to go into the presentation. Does that look good to everyone?
Looks great.
Looks great? Okay. Originally published in Australia, the United States governed by 600,000 despots has been utterly lost since 1855, surviving only in libraries, attics, and wherever else old newspapers go. Since writing his narrative, however, John Jacobs has become a footnote in his sister Harriet Jacobs' life, even though he once stood side by side with some of the most important and daring transatlantic abolitionists of his day, William and Ellen Craft, Martin Delany, William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and that's merely to name the American abolitionists that he worked with. He also once led a daring life outside America that we have precious few opportunities to learn about. The rediscovery of his narrative is arguably the most important recovery of an autobiographical slave narrative on record. which is a big thing to say and seems hyperbolic, given how important this genre is to understanding American history, the history of slavery, and the Black diaspora in the Americas. And yet, I would argue this is a true statement, or at least one I would strongly back. John Jacobs was not only Harriet Jacobs's brother and Frederick Douglass's ally, he was also remarkable in his own right, a self-emancipated slave and a transatlantic abolitionist, a sailor on 4 oceans, and a resident of 4 continents. John Jacobs was an African ex-American who chose to become a citizen of the world rather than remain in a nation that had enslaved 6 generations of his family and continued to threaten him with enslavement after he emancipated himself. By 1855, when Despots was printed in Sydney, Australia, Jacobs had given up a promising career as an abolitionist. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had confronted him with a terrible choice: either betray the radical abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison's credo, no union with slaveholders, by letting others purchase his freedom, and that would be a betrayal because to give money to a slave owner in exchange for your freedom was a way of indirectly supporting slavery. Or he might continue to speak in public after 1850 as a fugitive and run the risk of re-enslavement. He instead found a third way, falling back on the one trade that he knew would take men of color like him, the sea. Raised on the waterways of North Carolina, Jacob spent 17 of his 33 years of post-slavery life at sea. In 1839, and so you see more than 3 images before you. On the left-hand side, you see, upper left-hand side, you see the map of his whaling voyage to the Pacific, which I'll talk about in a little bit. The bottom middle is the example of a crew list agreement. That's John Jacobs' handwriting when he signed aboard a ship. There's an image of the whaling ship directly above that, and these are the print ads are ads for ships that he sailed on when he had moved to England and was working as a steward aboard steamships. And on the right is the list of all of his voyages after he moved to England in 1856-57 until he returned to America for the last year of his life in 1872. 36 voyages in all. In 1839, he escaped by boat to New Bedford, where he signed up for the whaling voyage that I talked about so that he could distance himself from his owner. And he came back 4 years later, a professional sailor. Whaling voyages were extremely long. From 1856, when he moved to the UK, until 1872, he worked those 36 voyages as either a steward, which is kind of like a gentleman's servant, but also with kitchen responsibilities, or a cook on ships transporting goods to and from England, sugar from St. Kitts, oranges from the Black Sea, cotton from Egypt and India. He was shipwrecked off the coast of Egypt, nearly re-enslaved when he found himself on a Liverpool ship that planned to run the Union blockade for Charleston. And actually, he went to court in the Bahamas, where the ship stopped, and successfully pleaded his case before a pro-Confederate court, and said the ship had announced that it was going to Havana, Cuba, and therefore by stopping at a port that was not on the original itinerary, they had violated their articles of agreement. And he actually won his case on those merits and was allowed to leave the ship. He helped complete the transatlantic telegraph line. He even sailed a gunboat to Bangkok as a gift for the new king of Siam, now best remembered as the king in The King and I. So on average, he spent about 10 months of each year at sea and 2 in London. And so in a way, you could watch Forrest Gump or you could read a historical novel and you would not encounter an ordinary protagonist who had the kind of incredible life that Jacobs had, the kind in which that ordinary person finds themselves in the midst of major historical events. And as a film or a book or a novel shows, in fact, that ordinary person plays a major role in bringing those historical events about, even if history does not remember that person's role. So what I've tried to do in recovering John Jacobs' life in my biography is to track his life, to show the place that he had in these events, show what he was doing, to remember him when he would be unremembered otherwise. So if this list of kind of incredible anecdotes suggests why I decided to write a biography of John Jacobs to accompany the republication of his autobiography, we also should remember that his own words constitute the strongest proof of who he was and what he stood for. I would not be writing, or I would not have written this biography if not for his words. For John Jacobs spoke and wrote fearlessly. And I would characterize the way he speaks as fearless speech. And I would say that there's the line between speech and writing in the 19th century and the age of the Gettysburg Address is not a very strong demarcation, that they blur together, no more so than for an ex-slave who spent a large portion of his free life telling his life story on stages and in schoolhouses and churches in order to gain access to publication, to publish the well-practiced life story that an ex-slave would develop in those locations. The phrase fearless speech is an allusion to a concept drawn from ancient Greek philosophy called parrhesia, which the historian of science and French philosopher Michel Foucault, in his last lecture courses, discussed, and which he addressed made in the last 2 or 3 lecture courses at the Collège de France that he gave. And we can translate parrhesia as something like frank or fearless speech. I view John Jacobs as just such a radical truth teller, someone who had the courage to tell the truth, all the while fully knowing the risks that doing so as a Black man in America entailed. If violence is the most obvious of these risks, less obvious is the courage it takes to know that by telling the truth, Jacobs would possibly have to accept the hurtful truth that American citizens did not want to imagine a nation that included him. It is just such a way of speaking truth to power that I believe both John and his sister Harriet Jacobs learned with Frederick Douglass and in the circle of Frederick Douglass in Rochester in the late 1840s. And so at the end of this talk, I'm going to think about what kind of abolitionist education John Jacobs received. And in particular, I'm going to dive into Rochester because I think it gets at the remarkable rhetoric of his autobiography. So in taking to heart, this is in the 19th century, the position that the transformation of the United States from a slave state into a free society could not be achieved through politics within the Union, Jacobs decided to pursue politics without the Union. That is what his act of leaving the country represents. Writing from beyond the reach of American law and outside the heavy hand of the white abolitionist editor, Jacobs demonstrates the potential of unfiltered, uncensored, unapologetic Black writing to speak these truths. If the American flag is to be planted on the altar of freedom, then I am ready to be offered on that altar, if I am wanted, Jacobs writes from London at the outbreak of the Civil War. But if it must wave over the slave with his chains and fetters clanking, let me breathe the free air of another land and die a man and not a chattel. The recovery of this narrative gives us an unprecedented chance to understand how, outside American law and humanitarian authority, African Americans reconfigured the relationship between liberty and truth. The rediscovery and republication of this lost autobiography represents the first opportunity to reckon with John Swanson Jacobs. Beyond American power, Jacobs speaks truth to American power in a life story built on the conviction that words can ring so true as to build new worlds. With a constitution and union like this, he writes, what hope of freedom is there left for the slave? When shown your oppressive laws, you point us to the Congress of the United States, as if something could be done there. What has Congress ever done for freedom? Whatever it has done, we might point to the current Congress and ask the same question. He continues, give me liberty with a cannibal rather than slavery with a professed Christian. No man should hold unlimited power over his fellow man. Of course, when I discovered John Jacobs's autobiography, I wasn't looking for it. I was working on a different book altogether about the history of nostalgia, which, contrary to what we think of nostalgia as today, once referred to a disease. I was particularly interested in how nostalgia was formed in medicine and how this medical concept came to be used in American institutions to manage and control discontented, confined populations, namely the slaves, soldiers, and sailors who unwillingly built Atlantic empires and often ran away or went on hunger strikes or deserted from armies in an attempt to get home. And after all, they were unwillingly separated from their homes and sent across the Atlantic in the first place. Attributing these acts to nostalgia was a way of redescribing them as a product of disease, of pathological homesickness, and redefining these acts as a natural occurrence and not a legitimate political act. That the act of desertion is the result of a kind of insane desire rather than a legitimate grievance with, say, an army that was forcibly re-enlisting Revolutionary War soldiers, even as the army was breaking its own rules by forcing them to enlist for longer than the term that was allowed to, so it's said to be possible, for example. Harriet Jacobs' autobiography entered the picture here because more than any other slave narrative, incidents in the life of a slave girl is concerned with medical care. And if you don't know Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, today it is the most read and studied autobiographical slave narrative other than Frederick Douglass's 1845 narrative of his life. It has been the text has risen to prominence since the 1980s and now stands in for the experience of women in slavery writ large. So it carries a big weight and a big responsibility. So while reading Jean Fagan Yellen's fantastic biography of Harriet Jacobs, I became fascinated with the endnote that you see before you, which suggests that Harriet's son Joseph had committed suicide in Australia in a fit of insanity in 1860. Several years later, I found out that he did not. But at this time, I didn't know this. John Jacobs and Joseph Jacobs had, after 1850, gone to California to try their luck in the gold rush, and then they were unsuccessful there, and so they set sail for Australia, which, though we don't learn about it in American schools, was going through a simultaneous gold rush. And actually, one thing that I learned while writing this book is that once you start to understand that Australia and America are going through gold rushes at the same time, you start to see how the modern Pacific Rim assumed its modern form, that these flows of people going back and forth between Australia, Asia, and America created the modern world we live in. For some reason, when John Jacobs left Australia in 1856 or 57, Joseph Jacobs did not follow him, and it seems he apparently died at some point. So I was wondering, was nostalgia assigned as a cause of death in Joseph's case, as would be expected, given that he was a sailor, and the disease was primarily diagnosed in non-white and ethnic populations? In other words, the way that we would list a mental illness as a cause of death, that was how nostalgia was being used at the time. And more importantly, I was wondering if John and Joseph Jacobs had left behind any statements about their own experience of displacement that we might compare against these official diagnoses. In pursuing these questions, I realized that since Yellen was working in the 80s and 90s and didn't have access to digitized Australian documents, I was in a good position to solve the mystery of Joseph Jacobs's fate. I quickly found out that there was a National Library of Australia historical database called Trove, and I began plugging in search terms. And because Joseph Jacobs, it turns out, is the name of many, many people who emigrated to Australia in the 1840s and 1850s, for the simple reason that John Jacobs, we know John Jacobs's middle initial is John S. Jacobs. I switched to searching for John S. Jacobs because it's a more unique search term. And so after searching for variants to account for the ways that software misrecognizes newsprint from the era, I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw this appear on the screen. And this is the top hit, this all caps title. And in fact, in 2016, when I found this, the first two hits were the two installments of the narrative. After collecting myself and reading this incredible title that does not sound like the title of an autobiography, but the title of a political pamphlet, I noticed that there is no byline naming Jacobs as the author of his narrative. So why was this the first hit? And so I held my breath and I clicked again, and this is what I saw. And what you see on the left is the first installment in April 25th, and on the right you see the second installment published the next day on April 26th, 1855. As I scrolled through the first installment, names I knew from Harriet's biography flew by, but not John's name. Then, about 3/4 of the way into the first installment, I saw this. Left on the bed of his owner, Samuel Treadwell Sawyer, a congressman from North Carolina, and the father of his sister's 2 children, the note reads, as you can see, "Sir, I have left you not to return. When I have got settled, I will give you further satisfaction. No longer yours, John S. Jacobs." And it's an amazingly polite way of saying fuck you, and an amazingly polite way of saying the tables have now turned. I am in a position to speak for myself and to tell you what to do. The note is Jacobs's, but he also did not write it, at least not in 1839, which is the time that he escaped. Though it zings with meaning, does settled mean that he's going to settle in the North, or does it mean that he's going to settle the debt that his ex-master owes him? Jacobs had been unable to write his own Declaration of Independence at the time. The laws of North Carolina had prevented him from learning to read and write. In 1855, however, when he reproduced his note, he wrote it himself. Thus, incredibly, the very note that Jacobs authored to demonstrate that he had been kept illiterate became the very same evidence nearly 170 years later that proves he is the author of his own life story. This writing is a spectacular performance of freedom, quite obviously in this case, but I highlight it also because it epitomizes two of the narrative's most remarkable aspects. The first has to do with Jacobs's use of performance. So, and this is where I'm basically condensing a longer argument which is about what are the circumstances and conditions under which formerly enslaved Black authors were writing their life stories. They weren't really allowed, or at least they were discouraged from writing autobiographies that we would think of as a typical autobiography, in which an author uses memory creatively and deliberately to portray their life. And in Jacobs's case, he's rejecting the kinds of autobiographies that formerly enslaved authors were encouraged to write, which are accounts of factual accounts of a life from birth until escape from slavery, in which the Black formerly enslaved author only recounts public events that can be corroborated by eyewitnesses, and only recounts things that happen to that person or to someone around them. Jacobs says no thank you to that model, and in his case, he reduces the account of his autobiographical experience to a minimum, paradoxically creating more space to critique slavery and more space to narrate his own life on his own terms. So, by absolutely refusing the expectations placed upon ex-slave authors to portray the horrors of slavery through graphic depictions of their own sufferings in slavery, and this is another important element of what he refuses, which he refuses to demonstrate how he was dehumanized in order to call for people to humanize him. He wants to say, no, we should not pay attention to my suffering. We need to pay attention to those who make my suffering possible, who cause my suffering, but also who permit these laws to exist. And in this way, Jacobs performs his life rather than describes it. His life story is not part of the plot, it's part of the style. In this book, who John Jacobs is located in how John Jacobs writes. In this style, which he began cultivating on board a whaling ship, where he taught himself to read and write. In William Cooper Nell's Boston and Frederick Douglass's Rochester, where he developed his rhetorical and analytical skills. And in the clamorous protests of Pacific gold miners and the British Empire's sailors. For John Jacobs, autobiography is a style of performing freedom. The defiant eloquence of despots epitomizes who Jacobs has become, testifies to how far he has come, and casts a sharp light on how much he has overcome. Read in this light, we begin to see how John Jacobs's autobiographical style is part and parcel of his education as an abolitionist. For Jacobs does not just showcase his talents as a writer and speaker, but uses them to denounce American despotism, which we would today call authoritarianism. Refusing to yield to pressures to represent Black pain in order to incite white anti-slavery sentiment, Jacobs draws up a revolutionary contract between his narrative and the reader, calling North Carolina slave owners and Washington politicians out by name, exposing Northern complicity, and arguing that the nation's founding documents represent the foundation of American slavery. If slave owners can be considered an evil, he writes, they are a necessary evil, and you can only remove the evil by removing the cause. When he submitted his autobiography to a London magazine in 1860, however, they cut out a 5,000-word critique of America's founding documents, which is the most sustained demonstration of his rhetorical and analytical powers, as well as his most urgent call for justice. While he began developing his life story in the late 1840s in Rochester, it is this section that he wrote all or most of when he walked into the Empire office in Sydney and asked for the two books on the left, William Hickey's recent correct edition of the Constitution, and the book in the middle, Richard Hildreth's Abolitionist History of the United States. Remarkably, this concluding part of the 1855 narrative abandons any attempt to narrate individual experience in favor of delivering readings of the Constitution, Declaration, and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And it's fortuitous that this book has reappeared at the time it has, because in 2026, on July 4th, across the nation, many of us are going to be reading from the texts of these documents and reckoning with them once again. To have works like Jacobs's and like the work that Jacobs's most resembles, David Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, is to have powerful testimonies to how these documents did not serve the people that they claimed to be serving, that they excluded people from the very category of personhood in the documents themselves. Jacobs calls his readings of these texts interlineations. And he takes this term from the law, and it means kind of a way of reading between the lines. Here's just one example of one of his interlineations and what he does with the text of these framing documents. We hold these truths to be self-evident, and we're going to be hearing all of this language soon, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that no slave held to service or labor in one state, under the laws thereof, escaping into another shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. That is the fugitive slave clause of the Constitution, which he has spliced together with the earlier language of the Declaration in order to demonstrate the hypocrisy through juxtaposition. He continues, to secure these rights, governments are instituted amongst men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, excluding Indians and free Negroes. When Jacobs writes, he trains his readers to understand that he writes between the lines of American law, and that he does so as a stranger, a person who does not benefit from these laws, because they were not written for him, and because as an exile, they no longer apply to him. From outside America, John Jacobs writes back against a nation that had made it impossible for him to live freely within it, that had enslaved him in the South, refused him liberty, life, and the pursuit of happiness in the North, and after 1850, destroyed any hopes he may have harbored that he would be able to live autonomously as a sovereign individual in America. If it appears miraculous that his own definition of freedom so far exceeded the possibilities he found for living freely in his own lifetime, this begs the question, just how did John Jacobs learn to articulate his vision of liberation and so eloquently perform what it means to be free in the only space that he could truly call his own, his autobiography? In other words, how did John Jacobs learn to be free? Oh, sorry, I apologize for skipping this slide. This is just getting into one of the, this is the quote that I read out on the right, and then on the left is a legal dictionary from the 1850s defining interlineations. In my biography of Jacobs, which accompanies his autobiography in the book, I reconstruct how John Jacobs educated himself and found opportunities for further developing his rhetorical powers in New Bedford, Boston, and Douglass's Rochester. Today, I want to focus on Rochester. And what follows is excerpted from the biography itself. And I'm focusing on Rochester not simply because we're talking about New York here, but because Rochester is such an important place for developing the kind of rhetorical performances of freedom that I'm talking about. William Lloyd Garrison's path pioneering abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, announced Jacobs's lecture tour with an abolitionist named Jonathan Branded Hand Walker, so named because after he was caught trying to help 9 slaves escape from Florida, he was imprisoned and then branded on his hand by a federal marshal with the letters SS, which stood for slave stealer. And for abolitionists, the fact that a federal marshal was doing this just showed how the government supported slavery and how either the North needed to secede from the South or some radical means of abolishing slavery needed to be arrived at. In the hands of the abolitionist cause, that SS was rebranded, no pun intended, to stand for slave savior. So John Jacobs was asked to be the undercard on this tour, which was a big stamp of approval for him, even if he had to be the warm-up act for this kind of martyr figure. The Liberator announced their lecture tour on December 3rd, 1847, the day that the first issue of the North Star appeared. William Cooper Nell, one of who was really instrumental in Jacobs's education in Boston, Boston is really where he learns to be an abolitionist in the Black self-improvement and educational organizations and abolitionist organizations of Boston, and also learns to participate in the white-run anti-slavery organizations in Boston, and eventually kind of sees that there are certain limitations to working within those organizations. And Nell had first moved to Rochester in October to work on the North Star after hearing that Douglass was starting up this new thing. And it was at this time that the Western New York town of 25,000. Is there a question right now? I see there's a hand raised, or is that for later?
Let's do that for later.
Okay, we'll save it for later. It was at this time that this Western New York town of just 25,000 was rapidly becoming the capital of the Black 19th century, the place where African Americans forged dreams of self-reliance and self-sufficiency into ways of life. Over the next 4 months, Jacobs and Walker walked from Boston to Rochester, giving 40 to 50 lectures at villages, towns, fairs, and conventions in between. 15 months later, Harriet would move to Rochester. The siblings, 18 months together in Rochester, actually represent the longest uninterrupted span of time that they were able to live together in one place during their entire post-slavery lives, during almost more than 30 years. And even that didn't guarantee seeing each other regularly, as John was away on tour for months at a time, and Harriet was busy running the anti-slavery reading room above the North Star office at 25 Buffalo Street. Yet it was in Rochester that John, Harriet, and William Cooper Nell became a chosen family, that they learned the frank, unsentimental truth to power language that characterized Douglass's speech and writing, and that white editors such as Harriet's editor, Lydia Maria Child, found too unnervingly radical to put into print. From Douglass, who we see in an amazing rediscovered, I think that's a daguerreotype, rediscovered a couple years ago. Harriet and John learned as one person who was in a small town in upstate New York, listening to Douglass speak for the first time, wrote, from Douglass one learns logic, the powers of ridicule, and language classically chaste. Like a piece of finished sculpture, beautiful in every outline of its symmetrical and unadorned simplicity. We wonder not that Douglass is severe, this admiring listener wrote. We applaud him for his boldness. We like to see a man stand erect and plead for himself, for his race and for truth, though blood drip from his blade. Our own shoulders may bleed, but we admire a fearless arm. In lecturing in over 150 towns with Walker, then Douglass, and finally by himself, John told the story of his passage to freedom, a freedom that remained unfulfilled. He walked roads that other lecturing agents, such as William Wells Brown and Lewis Hayden, traveled before him on the Western New York circuit, the burned-over district where so many religious revivals and new religious movements had come and gone. Just as in Douglass's narrative, the siblings' narrative cast performance, whether by speech or pen, as a means of demonstrating self-reliance and self-sufficiency within a nation that makes Black autonomy impossible. Incidents represents the only, or represented the only way that a Black woman could live autonomously in America, in a nowhere space that disables her body. In other words, the major infamous or famous event of incidents is that in order to elude her owner, the sexual predator, Dr. James Norcom, Harriet tricks him into thinking that she's escaped to the north, but in fact she hides in the crawl space above the storeroom of her grandmother's house. And she lives in that, I think it's like a 3-by-7 foot space for nearly 7 years. From that space, she's able to control her owner and to demonstrate her own abilities, but it's also a space that causes her chronic pain that lasts the rest of her life. Building upon, I think, incidents, John Jacobs's narrative constitutes a powerful argument on the legal impossibility of autonomy for Black men and women in America altogether. This search for autonomy underwrites John's life of migrant labor in the hinterlands of New York, the mines of California and Australia, and beyond in the open oceans. In 1849, after his tour with Walker, he then embarked on a new, this is skipping a little bit, he then embarked on a new lecture tour, this time with Frederick Douglass. And I wanted to give you a little bit of a taste of the zoomed in life of an abolitionist, the hardship or difficulty, the way that this was really an immense, I mean, not to say like it was hard, you had to walk both ways up a hill in knee-deep snow, but they really had to walk both ways up the hill in knee-deep snow just to set up one talk at a Methodist schoolhouse in one town, because they then had to walk back to the town they left their stuff at, sleep there, and then walk back to the Methodist schoolhouse the next day to give the talk, and then repeat that as they set up more speaking dates in the future. And this is how one set up speaking dates, by pleading, by persuading people. Douglass and Jacobs set off on their tour in knee-deep snow. At their first stop, they each spoke for an hour and a half. In his usual calm but feeling manner, Douglass wrote, Jacobs spoke of the foul treachery and ruinous wrongs connected with the whole system of slavery. Listened to with attention and interest throughout, he earned new subscribers for the North Star and sold some of his anti-slavery reading room books as well. The next day, as they rode another 10 miles, their hair frosted over and their ears, noses, and toes half froze. No meeting had been booked in Mendon, not too far outside Rochester, so they made their way to East Mendon and pleaded for a space to lecture in the Mendon Academy. Arriving in town often meant meeting with rebuffs, insults, and indifference, and searching long and hard for the kindness of strangers. In the old slave-holding town of Bath, New York, an Irish storekeeper assured us that this was not our native land and that we ought to go to Africa. The impudence of this proposition, Douglass wrote, shows how easily the oppressed may be transformed into the oppressor. At one stop, they earned a few more subscribers and were eagerly invited back. At another, the taverner told them that N-words were better off in slavery and that they were only making the slave's condition worse by lecturing against slaveholding. The next morning, he seated them at his table with his white family and boarders for breakfast. We found his practice better than his theory, Douglass quipped. In another town, a pastor greeted them with open arms and gave them his church for the day. In another, the room was so cold that they had to end early. And in another, bigotry, apostasy, hypocrisy, and slander did their utmost to prevent our having a fair hearing before the people. Despite such obstacles, Jacobs was unusually happy and evidently made a deep impression upon the listening hundreds present. In 16 days, they had traveled at an average of 12 miles a day, made some 20 speeches, got 20 subscribers from the North Star, and we hope have removed much prejudice against the anti-slavery cause. And much of that is the language of Douglass's diary of the tour, which are in quotes in the printed version. John returned to Rochester to find that Harriet had moved to Rochester and moved in with Quaker reformers Amy and Isaac Post, who served as pillars of abolitionism in Rochester. They also opened the eyes of Black abolitionists to the spiritualism that had taken hold in upstate New York in the 1840s. Harriet took over the anti-slavery reading room from John, and as John wrote in the North Star, the office has been newly stocked with the latest and best works on slavery and other moral questions. Some of the books that they sold included Douglass's narrative. Walker wrote his own narrative. Richard Hildreth's Despotism in America, which Hildreth also wrote the abolitionist history that Jacobs borrows from the Sydney, Australia newspaper office. And Hildreth's theory of despotism proves, I think, important for the autobiography. Books on slavery illustrated in its effects on women and domestic society, and also the unconstitutionality of slavery. All of the books that they were selling clearly made a deep impression and flowed into their autobiographies and into their understanding of the injustices of slavery. Setting out on the road again, this time alone, Jacobs met with racism, deceit, and disappointment. Ahead of one meeting, a Whig magistrate told John that if he lectured at his town, Spencerport, he would meet with eggs, bricks, and stones. John went anyway. His account of the meeting in the Methodist Church in Spencerport is longer and more impassioned than his recap of any other speaking date, and for that reason, I think, is telling. And I'm going to read out a quote just because it really gets at how he was developing this revolutionary rhetorical style of speaking truth to power in the 1840s, in this moment, and this is going to develop and grow, especially after he's radicalized by the passage of the Second Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. He writes, "The audience was large, but very disorderly. They hissed, like serpents, and stamped their heels like asses. Seeing they were displeased with my remarks, I asked to be corrected if I had given utterance to a single sentence that was not true. The reply was, "We have come to hear you talk about slavery." "That," said I, "is the very thing I am doing. If we had no slaveholders, we would have no slaves. I am discussing the character of a slaveholder in the President of the United States, Zachary Taylor. If slavery is a disgrace, upon whom rests the disgrace? Are you not guilty of all that I have accused you? Have I asked you for gold and silver? Or have I asked you to take your feet off the necks of 3 millions of your countrymen, whom you have so long oppressed? For this you threaten to stone me. Where is your sympathy? Is it with the oppressed or the oppressors? Dare you call yourselves friends to your country, who have elected to the highest office in the gift of the nation a man in whom you could see nothing but blood, rapine, and robbery? Is the battlefield the place for men to learn acts of humanity and have instilled into them the principles of peace? Is the slave mart the place for men to learn to deal justly, love mercy, and walk humbly before God? If these things are true, why am I to be stoned for telling them? It may be painful to your ears to hear them, but far more painful to us who are made to endure them. I came among you to speak for the dumb, the crushed and the bleeding slave. I pointed out the new links in their chains that you had forged. And for this act of justice and humanity, you barred your doors against me, and in violation of your law, you tried to gag me, because I dared to call Zach Taylor, that old and skillful murderer and cradle plunderer, a disgraced man. But if God spares my life and strength, there should be a little bit of a space here because this is his poetry. You shall have him in Florida with his bloodhounds training, and in Mexico the veins of his innocent victims draining. You shall have him ready and rough, until you repent and cry, enough. That night, the hissing crowd refused Jacobs's best efforts to direct them to examine their own relationship with slaveholders. If what they wanted was the old humanitarian contract, a safe pedestal from which to look down at the slave in general, as well as the ex-slave before them speaking, they were asked to agree to another contract, which bound them to analyze not the slave, the plantation, and the South, but those who made this system possible, the politicians upholding a pro-slavery America. Above all, President Zachary Taylor, a Whig and owner of 131 slaves, and also a former general in the Mexican-American War, which is partly what Jacobs is alluding to here. And Jacobs was a pacifist who signed pledges against the war. For an audience of uncertain allegiance like this one, such a contract must have been deeply unsettling, since speakers like Jacobs and Douglass expected their audience not only to scrutinize their politicians, but to look inwardly as well. In holding a mirror to their audience's faces, the two men assumed the power to direct them to examine their own complicity with slavery. When the audience hissed at him, they only hurt him enough to make Jacobs double down on his indictment of Taylor and those in the audience who had voted for him. What a time John has had on his last tour, Douglass wrote the Post. Will it not dishearten him? I fear it. Nevertheless, Jacobs continued to lecture through the summer, but even compared with his earlier struggles, and this is in the months leading up to the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, when the nation's politics are swinging toward pro-slavery more than at any other point in the 1840s, arguably. Jacobs wrote that at no time during my laboring in the cause as a lecturer have I found so few friends as on the present occasion. To make matters worse, he had had to hire halls and meeting houses in most of the places where I have been. By September, with news of the discovery of gold in every paper, he was thinking about going to California, since the people will not turn out in these cities to hear lectures on slavery. And so in fall 1849, he quit lecturing. In 1848 and 49, he had been on the road for at least 450 days. With so much mileage on his feet, his body, and his psyche, and with the political situation worsening, he began to consider other possibilities for life. This does not mean he quits his abolitionist career, but he hits pause at this moment because of the worsening conditions. We're conditioned today to imagine each new assault on our rights to be the result of extremists encroaching from the outside. But John Jacobs lived in just such a world of encroaching extremism, in which slave owners, politicians, and Northerners who benefited from slavery worked out pro-slavery deals again and again in 1820, 1833, and 1850 that were anything but equal compromises. For Jacobs, rising authoritarianism, what he calls in the language of his time despotism, is not an outlier and does not come from the outside, but is made possible by the framing documents of America itself, the Constitution and Declaration, which, he argues, so advantaged the slave-owning states as to make it impossible to abolish slavery through political participation. In other words, we need to be wary about rushing to blame individuals for actions we consider to be morally indefensible, or at least blaming them only. For even as a former slave, John Jacobs does not lay 100% of the blame at the slave owner's feet. Not only does his autobiography zero in on the stark injustice of owning humans, concentrating his dazzling intellectual and emotional powers into casting his blackness against the sharpest of white backgrounds, but it does so for a higher end, to prove that slavery and racial caste are written into the conceptual bedrock of the American Republic, starting with the Constitution, which Jacobs calls the bulwark of American slavery. The slave's life is a lingering death, he writes, and not simply because 600,000 legalized robbers operate a violent, abusive system of labor exploitation, but because American law permits them to do so. And since the law is the will of the people, a mirror to reflect a nation's character, Jacobs holds all American citizens, South and North, accountable for writing despotism into a democratic charter. That devil in sheepskin, called the Constitution of the United States, which contains and tolerates the blackest code of laws in existence, represents the great chain that binds the North and South together, a union to rob and plunder the sons of Africa, a union cemented with human blood and blackened with the guilt of 68 years. That's a great, amazing quote from the autobiography itself. We can now return John Jacobs to the heart of an America that has forgotten him. We can now imagine what Harriet Jacobs's autobiography would have looked like had she gone to California in 1850 with John, as she had talked about, and published her manuscript without the editorial intervention of Lydia Maria Child, without cutting the fearless truth to power language that both Jacob siblings learned in Rochester. And infamously, what Child's one big change Child made to the autobiography was to cut out a concluding chapter on the revolutionary martyr John Brown and replace it with a classic kind of tearjerker Victorian sentimental scene, the death of Harriet and John's grandmother. Looking outside the nation by taking off the blinders of ideology, as John Jacobs did, means writing back against the myth of the United States of America as a nation that progressively eradicates the legacy of its original sin through the development of its democratic institutions. Taking John Jacobs at his word requires taking seriously the claim that in 1776, the American nation embarked on two experiments at once, one in democracy, the other in tyranny. And I think it's only fitting to conclude with John Jacobs's own concluding words. In conclusion, let me say that the experience of the past, the present feeling, and above all this, the promise of God, assure me that the oppressor's rod shall be broken. But how it is to be done has been the question among our friends for years. After the prayers of 25 years, the slaves' chains are tighter than they were before, their escape more dangerous, and their cups of misery filled nearer its brim. Since I cannot forget that I was a slave, I will not forget those that are slaves. What I would have done for my liberty, I am willing to do for theirs, whenever I can see them ready to fill a free man's grave rather than wear a tyrant's chain. The day must come. It will come. Human nature will be human nature. Crush it as you may, it changes not. But woe to that country where the Son of Liberty has to rise up out of a sea of blood. When I have thought of all that would pain the eye, sicken the heart, and make us turn our backs to the scene and weep, I then think of the oppressed struggling with their oppressors, and have a scene more horrible still. But I must drop this subject. I do not like to think of the past, nor look to the future, of wrongs like these. God save us from the blood of the innocent. I ask nothing more. Thank you.
Jonathan, very powerful, very, very fascinating, very interesting, very incredible eloquence of a man at that time. I have one question though. You know, you found this autobiography in a Australian archive after he had traveled to Australia. I'm kind of curious, who do you think his audience was when he published that? I think you said like in 1860 or after he'd been in Australia. And I know he tried to publish in London, but who was his audience at the time? Who was he trying to reach since he's so far away from the United States at that point?
I mean, that is a great question, and it's still a little bit of a mystery that will require further research. As I alluded to at one point, there's more traffic of ideas and political sentiment between Australia and America than we usually don't think about that, but there's quite a lot going back and forth on these ships between San Francisco and Melbourne and Sydney. Among them, a lot of newspapers in these Australian cities are serializing Uncle Tom's Cabin. They're publishing Ralph Waldo Emerson's lecture on slavery. They're publishing strong statements against slavery and carrying on their own conversation about these topics. I mean, there's nothing like John Jacobs's autobiography that I found in an Australian newspaper, but there's a lot of anti-slavery discourse. And in fact, there are letters to the editor by other African Americans who had come to Australia as miners or sailors. And so I'm not 100% sure who he's writing for, if he's writing for the 400 or 500 other African Americans who are mining and who are in the cities and in the mines, or if he's writing for white Australians who are supporting and the anti-slavery cause, or if he simply needs to publish this thing before he forgets it or something. Because I imagine in my head that just like a singer or a musician carries around a repertoire of songs they've memorized and learned by heart, that if you've performed your life story hundreds of times on stages, you carry around your life story by heart. So to write it down might be an aid to memory. So it's a really fascinating question, and I'm hoping that I can take a trip to Australia in the next year and begin writing a longer biography of both Harriet and John Jacobs that will get to the bottom of some of these questions about what's going on in Australia that I wasn't able to figure out because Australia had such a tough lockdown during from 2020 to 2022.
So another question's in the chat, and comparing, you talked a lot about the editing that was done of his sister's biography and her writings. How much editing, if any, did you do to his autobiography, or is it presented essentially word for word as he wrote it?
So one of the remarkable and very fortunate things about this discovery is that there's a short editor's note written by the Australian editors of the Empire that says, we have scarcely altered a word of John Jacobs's, of this, they think they say something like this remarkable man's unvarnished tale, taking a quote from Shakespeare. And other than altering spelling and adding some punctuation. And I am inclined to believe them because they're not publishing a hardbound volume that requires months of editing. They are getting out a daily paper where there's a newspaper office is, always in a rush. They need to make sure that the spelling is fine and that the thing is laid out properly and it passes the standard of the day. That was fortunate. When I took up the piece, my goal was to make sure I did not introduce too many opinions into the editing process that could prove to be unfounded. The only thing I really needed to change was occasionally breaking up a few paragraphs if like a newspaper column was like the length of 5 pages. If in certain cases changing some of the spellings because it looked like the newspaper had introduced the misspelling, and same with typos and stuff. So I did as minimal editing as possible. And in place of the thing that I did do is I annotated the text a lot because with the difference of time, we don't know a lot of the references that he's making. The knowledge of the Bible that was assumed in 1855 is obviously not assumed today. And the knowledge of, the political situation is also going to be quite different too. Plus, he's also naming like a lot of local people in North Carolina and cases that he saw there that require some elaboration. And there I was also showing that Yellen's research was almost 100% correct and that his narrative verifies her research too.
Mm-hmm. So another question, this is about, are you familiar with what might be a parallel story described in a recent book, Prince Among Slaves by Terry Alford? Have you heard about that book? Know anything about it? It chronicles a slave from Mississippi.
I don't know about it actually, so I'm excited to learn the reference. I'm gonna have to look that up. There's kind of a flowering, an explosion of really great work that is focused on reconstructing the individual lives of formerly enslaved people in the biographies of the formerly enslaved people. And I think that's because that act, in a lot of ways, I've always thought of the biographies that I've heard about growing up, presidential biographies, the biographies I've read as more congratulatory and possibly almost conservative as in terms of an act of scholarship. This kind of writing I see as much bolder and more radical because to reconstruct the coherency and continuity of a person's life is to go strictly against the archive that is preserved of that person's life, because the archive of slavery does so much to prevent us from knowing who was related to whom, even what a person's last name was. To render a person into a commodity, into an object, is to render them kinless, to render them without a biography, without legal status, without identity. So to give someone back an identity is a radical act.
So I'm curious, as one thing you didn't really focus a lot on was perhaps John Jacobs' personal life. Did he ever get married? Did he have children? Did he, or was he just a traveling sailor for all those years and therefore left behind all that kind of domestic life?
So this is also quite interesting, which is he is a career sailor from 1857 on, when he moves to England. And initially, he's living at a institution called the London Sailors' Home, which is where single unmarried sailors stayed when they had just gotten back from a ship and they hadn't received their pay. The institution was created so that sailors would not immediately try to get up to no good and start drinking and going to brothels and stuff. And it was the Victorian period, so it was designed for moral reform. He lives there from 1857 to 1862. And then all of a sudden, he gets married, and he marries a white widow whose husband had been killed the previous year, who already had 2 kids, and he has one child with her, his only biological child, and they form this blended family and live in working class neighborhoods of Clerkenwell and Finsbury in London for most of until 1871-72, when John first goes back to America, to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and then eventually Eleanor and the children follow. It's difficult if you've ever done your own genealogy. You can find out things about your ancestors' families, who were the family members. You can find out the mere records that trace where they were and what their existence was roughly composed of. It's difficult to get at, say, what was the central drama of the family, what was the personality of an individual, what was the how did Eleanor and the children get along with Harriet when they moved to Cambridge. We can only speculate that John Jacobs is now buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery in the Jacobs family plot, right behind Harriet and her daughter Louisa. Eleanor Asplund is buried in the cemetery next door, in the Cambridge Cemetery. So I would assume that the families did not fully blend, but that's the farthest I can go unless I find more evidence.
Okay, we have some people in the chat who I think would love to follow up with you and contact you. Do you have any issue with me passing along your email to people who have questions or follow up on this at all? Or
I'll just put my email in the chat right now.
Okay, that's great. That's wonderful. So I have a final question. When did John Jacobs die? And did he ever feel that the Reconstruction amendments that were the 13th, 14th, 15th, did he ever have a view as to whether they were adequate, or do they adequately address, after the Civil War, his political perspective before the war about the Constitution and what it was?
So Jacobs dies December 19th, 1873, at around the age of 55. And he dies, it seems, from a sudden illness. There's no death certificate, but it seems the family was not prepared because a neighboring family they were friends with had to buy another plot in Mount Auburn quickly so that he could be buried there and be the first person buried in this plot before he was later moved to the Jacobs family plot. He doesn't leave behind leave behind many writings, or at least not many writings have been discovered in John Jacobs's hands. A lot of what we know comes from the correspondence of Harriet Jacobs to the Posts, which is the biggest archive of Jacobs family correspondence. That doesn't mean there isn't a lot of John Jacobs material out there that could shed light, for example, on one of the really fascinating questions, which is, why doesn't John Jacobs return to America sooner after emancipation in 1863? Especially when he talks about, I want to live in a free land and die a man and not a chattel, if the flag of freedom is waving over the fettered slaves. Well, if the slaves are unfettered, why didn't he go back? Was it just because he had a family and he was settled down? Was it because of his job? Did he not agree with the current political situation in America immediately after the Civil War? Or were there other reasons? My sense is that if he was anything, if he was like-minded, if he and his sister were like-minded after the Civil War, they both saw emancipation as insufficient, as mere technical liberation that did not actually guarantee equality and justice. Harriet and Louisa, beginning in the Civil War and running through the late 1860s, do everything they can to raise funds and to raise funds for recently emancipated slaves, to help build schools. They work in the schools as teachers. They work in hospitals. They work in all sorts of institutions in Georgia, Alexandria, Virginia, and the South to help be a major part of Reconstruction. In 1869, though, they stop. And I think they stop because they grow disillusioned. And in fact, they actually, Harriet and Louisa actually file one of the first civil rights suits in America when they sue the transportation company that had been running the steamship from New York to Savannah, Georgia. And they take the steamship company to court for denying them a first-class cabin on the basis of their race, in a way that anticipates Jim Crow segregation, but had been the informal law for a lot of companies at the time, and in other places, like we see in the in John Jacobs and Frederick Douglass's account of their abolitionist tour. It's at that point that Harriet and Louisa then give up fundraising and working for the Freedmen's Bureau and move to Cambridge and open a boarding house for Harvard faculty and students. And it's right around that moment that John Jacobs begins planning to return to America. So I would say that they never thought that, this is more speculation than I would be willing to put in print, but I would bet that they were not fully happy with how things were going in 1869. They did not see Reconstruction as even by then a success, even if we now think of it as ending a little bit later. That they, sorry, let me take a sec. Yeah, my guess is that Jacobs, if we can find his writing, that he would not be
Satisfied.
on board with the direction of post-emancipation America either.
Okay, I think we've been going for a bit and some helpful, great questions, but maybe Veronica, could I ask you to just maybe come back on? I think you wanted to say a thank you and a few last words. Oops, try it again, Veronica.
Okay, can you hear me, Chet?
Yes.
Okay. Jonathan, I just want to thank you for that very moving presentation. And I'm a little bit choked up still, so you can hear my voice is a little hoarse. It was, I read both your book and Harriet Jacobs' book, but your presentation really brought it home, and I'm so grateful that you were able to come and speak for us today.